Okay, we just better get started. Hello. This video is going to be talking about Light No Fire. Light No Fire is the new game that has been announced by Hello Games. Hello Games previously made Joe Danger, of course. Now they're more well known for No Man's Sky. And No Man's Sky came out in 2016 to a great deal of ill fanfare, which made them they gathered the reputation that they were developers that short sold or that shorted us on a certain gaming experience. But over time, over the past 7 years, they have turned around No Man's Sky in a way that has, I guess, brought people back. And I'm just going to sit here and talk about what I think Light No Fire represents. And the more I wrote about it and the more that I thought about it, the more I realized how odd and strange this context is. And I'll describe that as we go along. And then, I'm just going to have the trailer playing on loop over and over again. And I'm going to just talk about some of the things that I've noticed in the game. Before we do that, I should probably talk about my history with Hello Games and with No Man's Sky in particular. I never played Joe Danger. I played No Man's Sky on the PlayStation 4, and then I also played it on the PC when I built my first computer in 2016. And I have a certain love-hate relationship with No Man's Sky, and I guess the best way to describe that is, when a lot of people found themselves disappointed with the beginning of No Man's Sky, it felt like an early access title. I'm not going to sit here and say that I liked it then, because I think that's really pushing the bar. I think I was initially wowed by what was advertised, which was the ability to take off and land on planets. As a science fiction fantasy thing, I think that is something that all players and a lot of people in our generation. I grew up near NASA, and so I have this big love affair with space and the space aesthetic. But beyond that, the game really did not make good on some of its promises. I think it was all there on paper, except for multiplayer. I think that's going to go down in history, and we'll talk about that with Light No Fire. I think that a lot of people were rightfully disappointed. Now, what's bizarre about the trajectory of No Man's Sky is that as the updates came out, as more and more updates came out, I liked the game less and less. And so I've written a couple articles on Medium where I tried to explain that fascination. I think there was some weirdness in the planet generation in No Man's Sky that was teetering on the space between simulation and true to form geography that we see today. There were some oddities, and I felt that gap in between was really interesting and worth exploring. So, to point to one example, there was that moment when I think a Redditor spotted that two planets had spawned so close together in their radius or in their circumference or whatever that they were connected. And so there was a moment when you could see these massive landscapes colliding in very much like a Lars von Trier Melancholia way. There was no movement of the planets, but just that static representation of them felt like it was interesting to feel what it was like for the mind to try and rationalize or coalesce it. I thought that there were a lot of instances like that with lighting and with planet generation that I thought was weird and worth exploring. And over time, the game sort of leaned into its community in a way that I think was a mistake. I spent most of my time in No Man's Sky in those early updates up to the Atlas Rises update, I think. So I played the Foundation update quite a lot. So I played a lot of that before a lot of the color palette changes and before a lot of the like greater changes in the planet generation occurred. And then over time I stepped out of No Man's Sky as it became more and more about community building, as it became more and more about, I guess, progression for progression's sake, like offering a lot of things for bases that had not necessarily any functionality but were just decorations. And I wish that I could have kept up with it, and I think part of me wants to go back into No Man's Sky. I think this is a common feeling among gamers, is to go back into a game that you've dropped out of after some time to see if the updates produce a generally different experience. And maybe I did that once, but I think I had a good amount of fun with No Man's Sky. I must have put over 150 hours on the PlayStation 4. And I know for a fact that I have like 174 on Steam playing No Man's Sky on the PC. So my love relationship is fairly obvious. Now my hate relationship just has a lot to do with the decisions that the game made in favor of the player, which we'll talk about with Light and Fire. I think that would be a good transition. When I heard about the announcement, I did not watch the Game Awards. I had heard that the Game Awards were pretty insipid, and I know it's pretty cool to say that you don't care about awards, but more and more I remember I like to read books, and so once I went through and I looked at the Pulitzer Prize winning authors by year, and that list was really existentially shocking to me because I really did not know a lot of those authors, which led me to the belief that quite a lot of our awards for living authors bears little to no resemblance to what is going to be remembered historically, right? Like Moby Dick didn't get a Pulitzer, for example. So I think, of course, there are going to be some authors who managed to cross the Venn diagram. I love Louise Glick as a poet. I've mentioned her before. She won the Nobel Prize. I think that whether or not she is remembered in the future, she still does a lot of good work for me in my life psychologically. So I'm not going to sit here and say that like anyone who wins an award is a bad player or a bad actor, because that's just patently untrue. But I think that awards are this strangely tangential experience to what I'm looking for. So, but when my friend told me that there was the next Hello Games announcement, I was really excited because there are a couple developers who I am keeping an eye on. You know, the Outer Wilds developers, Mobius Digital, Disco Elysium's developers. I guess rest in peace. I don't think we'll ever get a Disco Elysium 2 just because of the problems that went on inside of that studio, which is a shame because Disco Elysium is kind of a lightning in a bottle moment. And then there's Hello Games. And I think the reason is because of their innovation. I think when you look back at the 2010s for gaming, you see that the biggest problem that was solved was space. And I don't mean like space like the genre. I mean the way of putting enough geometry and textures out in the world for players to explore. And, you know, Minecraft came out in the early 2010s, and Valheim came out in the late 2010s, and everything in between has been, well, not everything, but a lot of games in the 2010s were about addressing the need for space to allow a context for players to enact their fantasies, to enact, you know, a narrative, to progress through a space. Very different from the 90s and the 2000s, where oftentimes the amount of space that a player was given was only to the degree that the technology would give them not a width, but simply a linear pathway to progress through. And so I think No Man's Sky was a big part of that. It answered the question of how do you take a flat surface and wrap it around a spherical object in such a way that when a player walks around an object, that it won't break the system, right? And I think they did that to great effect, and I think they rightly should win innovation awards for their work on No Man's Sky, regardless of the game that came out. I think that the design and the math that they used to get to where they needed to go was painful and arduous, and they had a lot of setbacks, but I think that they accomplished what they wanted to do, and that always excites me because I like working with new forms over existing forms, and that so rarely happens that I would like to pay attention. So between them, Lucas Pope, Return of the Obra Dinn, one of my favorite games. I would like to keep an eye on what they do in the future, and they will pretty much be a day one purchase for me regardless of what the game is. Because I want to assist them and I believe in what they're doing, but also just because I'm interested to see how they innovate, because I think that does a lot of work for me to expand what I think a game is or what I think an experience is, and so I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. So Light No Fire was announced, so now we can start talking about it. I have a lot of notes here. I'm trying to think of, I think I might just talk about what I observed in the trailer, and then I will talk about some of what I'm excited about and what I'm nervous about, and hopefully that will make sense, and hopefully I can explain it in a certain way. And a lot of it is going to tie into what some of my dislikes were when it came to playing No Man's Sky. So yeah, let me look through my notes and see what I found out. So, that first shot highlights 4 people, and I think multiplayer is going to be a key component of this game, whether we like it or not. If you're a single player person, I think that a multiplayer Earth, there are certain phrases that come up that you can see on their Steam page. A procedural Earth, an unexplained Earth, or unexplored Earth, not unexplained, a fantasy Earth. So a multiplayer Earth is the first one, and I think this just comes from the trauma of being told by the world that your game doesn't have multiplayer when you said it did. I think that may have scarred them irreparably to the point where they have this obsession with multiplayer. How do you connote space is going to be one of the biggest things that I talk about in this video. In No Man's Sky, I think that... here's another thing I wanted to talk about. How odd is it that we have No Man's Sky come out in 2016 and Starfield comes out years later, attempting to do No Man's Sky, but in their own form factor, and they fail miserably. And now here we have Hello Games taking on Bethesda's bread and butter, the fantasy genre, with classic fantasy, right? And this is likely on the eve of Elder Scrolls 6, which will be coming out God knows when. We could see a similar gap between No Man's Sky and Starfield in the same way that we had Light No Fire and Elder Scrolls 6. I think it is just so bizarre that we have these kind of baton handoffs between developers every so often that really kind of shows the the incestuousness of gaming. There have always been copycats, if you want to call it that. ever since the beginning when Pong came out, there have been games that have copycatted. Now, I think that it would be rude or reductive to call something like Light No Fire reductive, because I think there are other things going on in Light No Fire that they're hoping to achieve that is obviously greater than something like Elder Scrolls, and is obviously like a totally different approach. But I just think it's interesting that these two developers are talking to each other in such tangential ways. Like, it's just, I don't know, that's interesting to me. So the word that comes up over and over again is Earth, and they claim that this is Earth-sized. Now, already I have some questions. For example, most of Earth is not land, it's actually water. I think it's 78% of Earth is water, and the rest of it is land. So when they suggest that, are they suggesting that the circumference of the Earth is the same as their planet that they have here for Light No Fire? Which would mean that I just don't believe that there's going to be 78% water in this game, just because water is a nice space between experiences, typically, if you've ever played Valheim. But it should not be the rule. It should always be the exception. So does that mean that there is more walkable land that we can expect to see in Light No Fire, or have they reduced the circumference of the Earth to account for only the amount of walkable land? I know that's a really insular and niche point, but it's something I'm curious about. Like, when we say Earth, do we mean the literal circumference of Earth, or do we mean a figurative, what we typically have with Earth, which is the walkable land? Of course, Earth also comes with other aspects. It's not just about the breadth, it's about the depth. So I was looking up some facets of Earth that we have. Mount Everest, 29,029 feet above sea level. I suppose I should be using meters, considering that Hello Games is an English company. I do apologize for that. And then Challenge Deep, which is in the Marianas Trench, is 35,876 feet deep, which just floored me that our deepest place is deeper than our tallest mountain. Everest could fit inside of it, which makes you wonder what's down there, right? Now, of course, we can't, on our own, climb Everest without some kind of oxygen assisting system, and then the pressure of the Challenger Deep would be way too intense for our bodies. So I looked that up as well. So we apparently, physically speaking, I'm not actually sure if this is the case, we can dive 3,280 feet before the pressure would kill a person. And then for Everest, we can climb 20,000 feet before needing oxygen assistance. Now, truth be told, this is a fantasy game, so all they have to really do is create a spell that allows you to not only breathe for longer while swimming, but can also handle the pressure, right? Like, who cares? And the same goes for Everest, right? If they want to deal with thin oxygen or with cold temperatures, then they can address that with some kind of fantasy power. And we'll see if the game can emulate that. They, in their description, they say who is going to discover the tallest mountain and who is going to find the deepest ocean. So I think Sean Murray and Hello Games have this obsession with geography, and they like that there are these variations that they too probably cannot expect. Although I suppose in the math there is a range, and there would therefore be an upper quartile, a lower quartile, and then finally the highest end and the lowest end. So we can expect that sort of thing. I think the last thing I want to say about the Earth aspect is that I looked up Magellan's Voyage, and I've did some just searching on the the circumference of the Earth and how long it would take to walk around it, and it would take around 2 to 3 years, closer to 3. And Magellan's voyage, in fact, took about 3 years, although he spent a lot of it sailing, of course. So I think it would be an interesting task for somebody to circumnavigate this planet, and I'm sure when a lot of players get into this Earth, they're going to attempt such a thing. We'll talk about space later, because obviously, as you can see, there's going to be mounts. I have no doubt that they're going to address some of the problems of being on one side of the globe while your friends are on the other side of the globe. But I wanted to mention those things for now. Okay. Obviously, it's a fantasy setting, so one of the things you notice immediately is that you're not just playing as humans, but you can play as anthropomorphized characters. This has me very excited, because a lot of the designs for the characters, rabbits, otters, honey badgers, a lot of these that you can see really remind me of the Brian Jacques Redwall series. And that, not Harry Potter, but Redwall was the book series that I grew up with. I must have read 13 or 14 of those books in the series, and I loved them as a child, and I read them up until about 6th grade, I think. So I started I'm trying to think of when I started, maybe 2nd or 3rd grade, and then I continued through 6th grade. I eventually kind of moved away from them naturally. I've tried to go back and reread them, but they strike me as incredibly juvenilian. The repetition of slapstick humor, the prevalence and constancy of food, the childishness of some of the accents, just strikes me as a series meant for particularly the latency period, kind of that 7 to 12, kind of that puberty age range. But still, I wanted to give a shout out to those books because I see a lot of that in this, and if they are going for classic fantasy, there is something that is really interesting about it. I think in Brian Jake's books, there are a mixing of the different animals, but there is also, Redwall is predominantly mice. The Fortress of Salamandastron has badgers as the leaders. I don't remember I think badgers are rather rare, so I don't remember in that series how much they're presented. I remember reading The Long Patrol, and it's a great deal about rabbits. And I don't know, it's just weird to get sort of your early childhood back to you. I'm curious if Hello Games directly referenced Brian Jacques, I don't know how to pronounce his name, when creating these possibilities for characters. We'll have to see. And then continuing with the fantasy setting, there's swords, there's bows, and then there's staves. So, the classic warrior, archer, mage. I think it's fascinating that comparing No Man's Sky to Light No Fire, No Man's Sky didn't really have a role-playing progression system. Quite a lot of it was based on your equipment, rather than your inner being, than your avatar, than your player character. And I am very curious to see how they do skills, if at all. I think Valheim is the survival experience to beat right now. I have a server with friends. We're anxiously awaiting the Ashlands update at the time of this recording. It seems like we're close. And I think that their approach to skills is weirdly effective. It's very grindy in the sense that, a lot of this you're gaining over time, and that the road to 100 is fraught with peril, considering that when you die, you lose a lot of your experience. But the difference between being able to woodcut at level 100 versus level 1 is a meaningful, large difference. And that is also the case with stamina. And it also turns out to be the case for weapons. From level 1 to level 75, you can feel the difference fairly dramatically. And I'll be very curious to see how they go about skills in this game, how many combat skills there are, how many passive skills that there are, how many different weapon types will there be. You know, we see swords, and we see bows, and we see staves, but do we see, I'm not sure if there are axes, and I'm not sure if there are spears. There are a lot of different types of medieval weaponry that people like to identify with whenever they play these sort of games. So we'll have to see if that's the case. I might start pausing the trailer so that I can talk about specific things. So I'll wait until it resets, because I think that'll help guide. Now that I've talked about the overall stuff, it'll be good to talk about specific instances. So how to connote space. So obviously I think that their ability to do depth of field, their ability to gauge space between one place or another, great example here, right? It's the ultimate romantic notion. We have a camera that's overlooking this great expanse. It reminds me of that painting. It's, I think, an overused painting at this point, where it's the back of a gentleman and he's looking out and there's the mist. It's very reminiscent of this, right? There's a lot more mist, so you can't see the bottom, but it gives this romantic notion of exploration, of the vastness of the place that we have been put into. And so it's clear that they're addressing that here. You can see a kind of structure here in the middle. You can see a flock of birds, and the way that their procedural generation has done flocks and schools and herds immediately feels better. There's something about the animation. They have dramatically improved how fauna move around, which is great. Three-dimensional clouds, volumetric clouds, that are not just a skybox, but they're within the play space, has always been impressive. But you can still feel the whiff of No Man's Sky's engine, right? There's something about the color palette. There's something about the way that the geometry creates itself in general. One minor thing we could talk about is the way that these cliffs are situated. So if a player were to get stuck in the water, what would be their prerogative for getting out? And it makes me wonder if there's some kind of Breath of the Wild climbing system. There are hang gliders, and so by inference, you could suggest that there would be a climbing system that goes together with that, right? If a glider is a way to get down while maintaining distance, then climbing is a way to get up vertically so as to utilize that glider. So I would hope that there is a method for climbing, if it uses a stamina system, something like that. Breath of the Wild came out a long time ago, along with the Switch, so it stands to reason that they may have taken some of those aspects from Nintendo and their fantasy flagship title, and Hello Games may have applied it to their own new fantasy title. Everyone here has the same bow. I just thought that was interesting to point out just now. A multiplayer Earth. Is there anything I want to say about this before moving on? Yeah, I think that players will be able to join each other's wherever they are immediately, which I think sort of has to happen. I kind of wish that the game would be a little bit more hardcore and would place players wherever, but I can understand why that would not be the case, just because it would be very difficult for exploring players if there's a fourth player who had to step out. Reconnoitering with that person, reconvening with that person would be difficult. Okay, so here's my least favorite part of the trailer, is this shot. And it has to do with the wind. I really have never liked the way that trees move in No Man's Sky, and you can still see that here. Just the uniformity of the way that those trees move feels like the trees aren't actually moving according to wind, but they're like stretching and retracting. I think that Valheim does tree movement so flawlessly that it's the game to beat when it comes to the dynamic feeling of nature. I think grass looks great. I think the clouds look great. I think the pollen and other artifacts that show depth in the air and movement, I think that's also great. Never really had a problem with that. I've just really had a problem with the uniformity of the way that the trees move. So, very minor point. We get what looks like a very knowledge stony thing here. This sort of gives you the idea that the world is not going to be empty, but is going to be filled, and I have a lot of concern about that. It's the same concern that people have with Starfield, where every time you land, someone else lands with you to create like an event. And one of the things I always despised about No Man's Sky, even in the early updates, was that I was trying to live my own outpost self, and it felt like the galaxy was filled with tourists who were just flying around everywhere, like taking pictures and like going to the store. And it's very difficult to explore when everything feels like a backyard. None of it really felt like it was totally alone. Those spaces did exist, but unfortunately, the kinds of spaces that existed without NPCs was unfortunately rather dead and repetitive. So I think that I'm very nervous about the amount of NPCs that we'll see in this game. You know what? One thing we could talk about, I guess we'll talk about it when we get to an unexplored Earth. So I'll hold my breath until that moment. I love this. It's there's the fog of war, I guess, or the dust has really closed in to create a lot more claustrophobic of an experience. Something like the elephant graveyard in Lion King is the feeling that I got from this, right? A land of the dead. Obviously, there's skeletons in front of us, so we can infer that. Why they have a blue glow, I don't know. Maybe it's just easier to point them out. It's a nice contrast to the oranges and browns here. We get quite a different series of foliage. I'm sure in the bottom left-hand corner this would register as a different biome, but we don't see that here because we don't have the heads-up display in front of us. And then we have old and abandoned ruins. How many old and abandoned ruins, I'm not sure. It's great for games to have a sense of history that has been left behind. That's in a lot of games. It's in The Legend of Zelda. It's in Elden Ring. It's in a lot of games that attempt to fill a space without having to embody the space, because that's always been difficult for video games, is how to create texture for the player to fill in. And so to do that, you use abandonment. Moving right along. And unexplored Earth. Okay, so how unexplored? So I also did some math, and the peak player count for No Man's Sky was right at release. It was 212-ish thousand people. And so if you were to extrapolate that to Light No Fire, if we assume that many people are going to be playing. Now, of course, that's really not going to be the case forever, right? Because not that many people play No Man's Sky right now. I think the average player count's around 8,000. But even at peak, if we were to use that for Light No Fire, considering that this is the size of Earth, the population of Earth, even at 10,000 BCE, was I think like 4 million. The closest I could get was the population of Europe in 10,000 BCE, and even that was 469,000. I had this really bizarre rejection of this game when I saw the trailer first, and I saw that it would be multiplayer with NPCs, because I thought that there would not be enough space for everybody, which is ridiculous, because what I'm trying to say with this point is that it's going to be 212,000 people, which is half of the earliest that we can attempt to even place mark the amount of population at 10,000 BCE, and it's going to be the size of Earth. So, if anything, there's going to be plenty. I will be very curious to see how Light No Fire addresses exploration. So, in No Man's Sky, there is no map. There is a kind of a galaxy coordinates system, but as far as where you've been and where other people have been, is done twofold. So one is through that galaxy coordinate system where you can kind of see at the basic level that somebody has been here because they have explored it, they've named it, because that is their discovery. On the other hand, there is the sign of the persistent world that has been built on the planet's surface itself. Beyond that, there's really no in-between method to like scan a planet and to see like, oh, is there other signs of a player here right now. I'm not sure if that's changed since I've played No Man's Sky, but that's the original idea that I've gotten. Let me take a drink real fast. Now, Light No Fire is different. In Valheim, there is a map of the massive world, and as you uncover it, the fog of war disappears. And with other players, you can have this cartography table where you can share your map exploration with others. The server that we have in Valheim right now, we play without a map, and that has been a glorious event, I guess, or a glorious time. We've had to figure out how to navigate and how to register that we have navigated a space. And we've drawn maps by hand. It has been such an incredible way to explore, and it really helps to cement how difficult cartography is, how to do it accurately, and especially in a game like Valheim where the geometry repeats so frequently. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to be the case with Light No Fire, but it does raise the question of how exactly is a player going to be able to register where they've been before, and how do they know what others have registered? Now, at the basic level, there could be nothing. There would be no map, there'd be no sense of discovery, and it would be all up to the players to, through Discord or through friends, talking to each other, to name certain places, to draw maps, to, get a globe going, to try and communicate with each other, this massive space. Now, that would be something that I don't think a game would really do by default. And the reason for that is that we're not dealing with a physical, literal space like we have today, where a person resides in it, although I suppose VR could easily be implemented with the way they've done VR in the past. But for most players, they encounter Light No Fire in a flat two-dimensional screen that projects a three-dimensional space. So I think that's much harder for the brain to acclimatize. Not only that, but we're dealing with repeated geometry in a way that our Earth, is so interestingly varied that games haven't quite addressed. There's just too much specificity in rock formations and foliage, in color, the way that things look, the way that history erodes things. I think that there's still a long way to go to represent that in video games. Whereas even in Light No Fire, there's going to be repetition of biomes and repetition of trees and repetition, just because an art team could never have the time to completely replicate all the variegations in Earth. So there's going to have to be some map system, and I'll be very curious to see what that is. If it was me, and I thought about this earlier, you would have two features or functions in the map system. One is that you would have your total area explored, And that could come from some item or some automatic thing where, let's say you went to a settlement or a town, you could place your knowledge into an orb or a hub or however they want to do it. It's just a totem. And when you place it in there, you have the separate choice of getting discoveries from whoever else has donated that back. And so you get this huge communal sense of exploration. Now, the reason why I separate those into itemized slots is because there are going to be some players who really don't want to know. They want to figure it out for themselves, and I think that's great. I think going in blind and kind of being kind of the rugged individual is what America does best, and so I can imagine a lot of Americans who say, like, here I'm willing to contribute, but I want to see these places firsthand. I think there's going to be so much space that I would rather have that knowledge, and I would look forward to contributing. Now, how centralized they make that system, right? If it's going to be like No Man's Sky, where there's going to be a social space that everyone can enter all the time, I am starting to get a little skeptical of that idea, just because the major theme of connoting space, the feeling of space, is starting to be ruptured by that idea. So another method, I like the dotted line method for wherever your player has been. There's a dotted line up to a certain point, maybe the past 10 days or 30 days or maybe the past like million steps, right? I think that a milestone system could be good for where your character has been last. Obviously, there should be some kind of compass to orient yourself. And then at the upper register of this map system, there is the total transparency, where you will open a menu, and one of those sub-menus is going to be the globe. And you will effectively see everybody who's playing at that moment and what they have uncovered in real time. Now, I don't see that happening just because that would be so heavy on bandwidth to try and communicate that to each and every player. So I don't know if that is necessarily going to happen. Maybe it'll be updated over time. Maybe there will be some separate method that you can search online to where you can see everything that everyone has explored. And that could be interesting because, again, as long as it separates and itemizes those two, then players are willing to use it, and then their players don't have to use it. Okay, sorry I took so long to narrate that point, but I think how to do cartography and how to do maps, and then as well how filled is the world going to be with NPCs, is really going to determine what unexplored means. So the execution of that, I think, is going to be one of the biggest points. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. We get the health in the top left. I think we get the temperature in the bottom left. We get the biome type in the bottom left. I think using symbols for the biomes is a pretty cool touch. That makes me sort of worried that there's a very narrow, limited amount of biomes, but of course that's silly because you can create as many icons for types of biomes as you want, and as long as the icons reflect what kind of biome you're likely to expect, well then I think that's fine. I think the only thing I am not sure about the HUD, let's go back, is what this sun thing means. I'm pretty sure it's time of day, like it gives you a sense of time. Like this very much feels like the afternoon. But what's interesting is that I don't really understand how the movement from the water to out here changes the time of day dramatically. So I think I have to conclude that the sun and the moon is just a basic it is day and it is night. And I think that there's something else going on with this circular bar. To me, I think that light no fire is going to be thematic of something that happens between the day and night system, and having enough light is important for something, for some kind of conflict in the game. Like, does night present a danger that the player has to overcome by using light, very similar to Valheim. And this bar will tell you how much light that you're in and how safe you are, because maybe there is something that happens at night, because we only really get one night experience or night shot, and it occurs here. And I'm going to fast forward to it. And so there's night, there's a plus there, I'm not quite sure what that's about. And then there's this bar yet again, and I'm wondering if that, having that torch, I don't know, because this player doesn't have a torch. I don't know, I'm theorizing that there's perhaps something going on here. While we're here, one thing I don't really like is how not dark the nighttime is. I am a big fan of, whether it's Dragon's Dogma or whether it's Valheim, that night should be very dark. But there is a chance for the moon to come out. I think one of the great things that modern technology can do is high dynamic range and high contrast. And so I think trying to put that in games, to me, matters quite a lot more than like resolution and image quality per se. So I don't know. It's just one shot. We'll see. Okay, so let's see. We should probably go back. I think other YouTubers out there are going to talk about the shot by shot breakdown. There's a big octopus here. There's a sunken ship in here. So there are things to explore, right? I think the big animals are really cool. I think they're bigger than a lot of things that we've seen in No Man's Sky, and they move a lot more naturally. So then again, these may just be the shots that they managed to get where they look like they're moving naturally, right? If all the octopus really needs to do is just do a 180 degree turn and go in the other direction, and then the spell is immediately broken, and you're like, oh shit, like we're back in No Man's Sky. So I think that the animals have always been funky, but they look pretty good here. Okay, so one of the things I thought was really interesting about, there is this shot, I don't know what to say about this shot, but I'm going to move on, is here. So this to me strikes me as there's a lot going on. So there's different materials for building, there's different styles. You can build at 90 degree angles, you can build in slants like 30 or 45. And I'm quite sure that once you set down I'm building an outpost marker, that you'll be able to build pretty much anywhere. There's wood cutting. Most importantly, I think, is what is occurring here. So there's a player that is physically moving a resource, and I don't really see that very often. And I think that has a lot of implications. So in No Man's Sky, whenever you would use a mining laser, the thing that you would laser would just obliterate and would go into your backpack. And when you gave things from one player to another, it would never occur in physical space. It would just be transferred digitally. It would just be a transfer of like the name of the material and the amount of the material into someone else's backpack. Now, this to me strikes me as very interesting, where the challenge of the game may not come from other players. I don't think there's going to be widespread player versus player, nor do I think that the challenge may come directly from combat. There may simply be a player versus environment, taken quite literally, of you against the elements, and you trying to address that with structures and with kind of role-playing upgrades of your person, your equipment, in order to traverse some more difficult spaces, quite like Valheim. And so I think it's very interesting that a player is physically moving a resource, because that implies that there is going to need to be a lot of cooperation between people in order to not just gather resources, but to transport those resources from one place to another, to ferry those resources. And perhaps that may be why cities and civilization forms. So I have this whole thing about they attest to the fact that in Light No Fire, it's on their Steam page, that you can build persistent buildings and you can build civilizations and you can build like towns and structures and things like that. So you can gather together. But in order for that to really work well, we sort of have to address what it is about people that makes them want to gather in the first place. And I came up with a list here. Resource scarcity, danger, division of labor, and this is kind of the same thing, but it's more like the depth of it, specificity of skills, and then the sharing of knowledge. So resource scarcity, especially food, a food surplus. Plenty of historians have talked about the rise of agriculture as a way to create more stable communities. I have no idea how they're going to do food in this game, nor how they're going to do the survival elements. What is hunger? What is thirst? I think Valheim again addresses this rather well, where you can survive indefinitely without food, but your health is extremely low. It sits at like 25 or something like that. And to bolster your fighting abilities and your survival rate, that is when you eat food. I would hope that No Man's Sky would address that, right? Like, should a player starve to death in Light No Fire? Is that the kind of difficulty that we want in the game? Now, if you look back at explorers in the past, starvation was a very real thing, and scurvy was a very real thing. In fact, The Long Dark, a survival game, has introduced scurvy into their game as a way to create a sense of authenticity and realism. So how much authenticity does Light No Fire want to have? I think even more than connoting space, I think that the question of authenticity of survival is sort of the paramount question that every single survival game has to address in a way that gives their audience total transparency when deciding if that game is for them. So I think The Long Dark does a great job of it, where it presents an atmosphere and aesthetic that lets you know that you're playing something that is far more interested in the realism of survival. We'll see what Light No Fire does. Danger, I think if the game is going to have some kind of discrepancy between light and dark, where there are very real threats, in the Steam page, it talks about this constant threat of survival, when it's talking about classic fantasy. That is interesting to me. Like, No Man's Sky doesn't, except for permadeath, which is, will there be a permadeath mode in Light No Fire? I'm not sure. No Man's Sky doesn't necessarily strike me as that kind of game. It seems far more optimistic and more existential in nature than pragmatic or practical in that way. So I'll be curious to see how much danger there is. Division of labor. This goes back to skills. I think here you can see literally a division of labor happening in real time. So you've got builders, and then you've got woodcutters, and then you have the farriers, the laborers, moving back and forth. So I think that in this trailer, I'm assuming it was intentional that civilizations are going to be about that. Now, what your skills are, like, if you carry more logs, do you have higher strength, which makes it easier for you to carry more logs, which makes you good at that particular thing? If you cut trees down, does your woodcutting skill improve? Are you able to cut down trees faster? If you're a builder, the more you build, can you be more efficient with your materials? Like, how far are they going to go with the division of labor between active and passive skills to facilitate that kind of thing? And is there enough depth where there is a very real specialized difference between those players? And you sort of have to decide early on in the game what you want to specialize in so that you can bring your skills to a community. Few games do that because they want players to have fun. They want them to explore all the different sets, and they don't want their players to have to play 400 hours of a game to get that effect. I think there are some games like EVE Online that totally lean into the idea that you're not going to be skilled at everything, because that would remove the benefit of some skills as choosing those over others. I, for one, am on the EVE Online spectrum. I've played Deep Rock Galactic, which I think is the best co-op game I've ever played. And one of the interesting facets about Deep Rock Galactic is the asymmetric use of skills. So not everyone can do everything. The gunner can do things that the scout can't do, and vice versa. The engineer, the digger, there are just certain things that they provide that are A, useful, and B, discrete. And so I feel like any cooperative game from now on that wants each player to feel like they're important really has to do that. Because if everyone is the same, then that implies that one person can do everything. And as much as I hate to say it, if you're going to make an effective multiplayer co-op game, you can't allow that. And so that question will be interesting to address in Light No Fire. Is a man an island, or is no man an island? And I think it should be the latter. Division of labor, specificity of skills, we talked about that. The sharing of knowledge, we also talked about that with the map system. Are there going to be methods for players to relay not just map knowledge, but what is inside of the places that they've explored? Or you can find a legendary weapon here. How are items going to work? If one person finds something from a place, is it gone forever, or does it come back to where you could tell later players this is where you need to go? And are there going to be YouTube videos that say, here are all the places in Light No Fire where you can get legendary gear? We've placed portals right next to these places so you can just walk up and grab it, and you can be kitted out in 5 minutes. Here are all the coordinates. Like, I don't know. So I will be very curious to see how civilizations and towns and structures come up. And I mean, to me, this is like, I feel like this is the shot with the most information. We can move on from here. Sorry I talked so much about this. I just am geeking out about the whole thing. And oh God, talking about mounts. Is there anything really to say beyond what No Man's Sky did? So I think, first of all, look how beautiful this is. I guess I haven't really talked about the graphical presentation of this game, and I think other people have mentioned this too. Just the draw distances look beautiful. The way that the foliage interacts, I am kind of concerned about sort of the shadow distance and kind of what things look like from this perspective. I will be honest and say that that's interesting. You can use your bow on your mount. Does that imply that there are going to be enemies that you're going to want to shoot from the air that are on the ground? Or even more interesting, are there going to be air-to-air conflicts, air-to-air combat? I don't know how deeply involved that is going to be. But I think the idea of No Man's Sky, of lifting off and going into space, had this weird symptom or drawback or side effect, however you want to call it, of the lifting off and then flying a couple hundred meters and then dropping down again. I think every player did sort of experience that, even with land vehicles. The ability to always call your ship and then to get in it and then to fly. I think in Starfield, a lot of people would have appreciated that instead of trekking along as they did. They wanted some kind of way to mediate that space. But I think it is like awkward and sort of breaks the romance of being in the world. So I will say right off the bat that I have some skepticism about mounts, because I can just see, this this getting up and getting onto the mount and then flying, to the top of that mountain and then getting off. Did you really climb that mountain, or did you just use your ship, right? So I think that the mounts are a nice feature that I suppose people are going to like. But I think it may, once again, hamper the connotation of space. I guess we better talk about the connotation of space. So I've said that a lot. So they have denoted quite clearly that this is an Earth-sized planet to explore. I get that, right? That's the denotation. That's the physical definition of what they are saying, is that, hey, it's the size of Earth. To give you a dictionary definition comparison. But just like No Man's Sky, the denotation is not the full story. There is the feeling of space, how vast a space is, and that how much does that determine how much effort or work is going to go into exploring that space. So I'll tell a story about Valheim, which is that originally when we had our server, we had no portals. And this was fun for a time, but then we really started to gain a sense of just how big Valheim is. And to have to ferry materials back and forth from one base to another, what we discovered was it changed the way we played the game, to where we wouldn't have one cohesive home base that we would gather together to build and to embellish and to make pretty and to have all of our supplies. It created a very nomadic experience where we hardly ever saw each other. I had one friend go northwest and one friend go east, and there was, they would make bases as they went along, and they were far more nomadic, and they would spend a lot of time kind of scavenging as they went. And this was interesting, but ultimately very alienating. And so we eventually turned portals on as a way to centralize a lot of our efforts. And we decided that one portal per continent would be the way to go. So we tried to limit it ourselves. Now, there are certain things about Light No Fire that don't really allow that to happen. Like the political action of saying, can we use portals, can we not use portals, is going to be really decided by Hello Games. So I don't think we're really going to get a choice from that. Now, consumer side, a group of players can decide for themselves not to use portals that are in Light No Fire. I have no doubt that Light No Fire will have some sort of transporting method. I just don't see them not doing that. Otherwise, I think you would get this bizarre method of cheese where players would be friends with other players so as to get to a certain place in the map. And so certain players would serve as an anchor or a post. Now, I think the question then becomes, how do you want to do this portal system? I think that creating portals in Light No Fire should be incredibly expensive. I think that it should be a huge collaborative effort, and pretty much every material from every biome should be represented in the requirements for a portal. That way, when one is constructed, it conglomerates a lot of people into a space. I also think that there should be a minimum distance between portals. And I think the minimum distance should be quite high. I think that none of these things will happen, just because I think for the average player that just wouldn't be fun. If you were told that to get a portal, to get your friends to work together in one space, or to get other people to notice you, would involve such work, I think that would be, they would call it grinding. I think the minimum portal thing would cause people to, similar to, I guess, the end of the West in the American West after the Civil War, to put up barbed wire fences, causing, everyone to be land grabbing like crazy. Putting down a portal would become this key effort so that you would have your own land that you could dominate for yourself, so that no one else could build a portal, and you would keep it there forever. This is my land. This is also my land. So I don't see the plans that I think of. I don't see it as working in a video game. So the question becomes, each group in Light No Fire is really going to have to decide for themselves how deeply they lean into the convenience of the geography transporting, or geography, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess movement system. Like, how much are they willing to traversal, use mounts, or use portals, or use the social systems. Hopefully for me, these will be not interrelated too deeply, and they'll be separated enough to where there will be some discrepancy between them. What else do I want to say? I think I covered it. Connoting space, right? It's all well and good to create an Earth-sized space, but if too much geometry repeats, if you have too many ways for shortcutting that space, then what are we really talking about here? We're not talking about space, we're talking about like a vacuum. Like, and that's an interesting difference, right? There's the space of Earth, and then there's the vacuum of outer space. And I think understanding and delineating between those differences is a key thing that a game designer would have to do. What else have I not talked about? It's already been over an hour, so I feel like I've talked quite a bit. You can see a lot of the No Man's Sky style terrain generation. Excuse me, as a player comes in. The game is talked about as being rich with lore. So you get a sense of that with these giant creatures. I have no doubt that there's going to be a similar text-based system to No Man's Sky. I think that's great. I don't necessarily think that their games should be heavy on storytelling. I just think it should present a sort of like basic minimum experience of story, in the same way as like Canterbury Tales, for example. All you really know about Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is that they are all going to Canterbury. What matters more is this collection of people and how they came to be going to Canterbury. Like, where do they come from? What is their story? I think quite a lot of that should be the experience of Light No Fire, where they have for themselves the experience, rather than a story or an experience given to them. Differing biomes, once again, those icons, you get the sense that this is more of like a savanna. Okay, and so we get NPCs. There are definitely, I'd be curious to see what the global population is of NPCs, if Hello Games even knows that. I think it's interesting that this player has the same shield as these crests do on the walls. So I think there are going to be certain subgroups, and you can collect items and gear that reflect that particular subgroup or particular culture or whatever. So players can find ways to self-identify with ideologies. Hopefully, you would think that ideologies would exist. So I guess that's something that we can talk about. Is I wrote an article comparing Valheim with Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition. It's a book of political science, I think, or maybe social science, where she goes into the different hierarchies that she creates for herself and that she presents to you about how human beings are able to create meaning for themselves and how they feel authentic. It's a very Heideggerian look at the aspect of authentic human behavior and human action. And so she divides it into 3 categories. So there's labor, there's work, and there's action. So labor is exactly what it sounds like, although she kind of tethers it more to the labor of the body, of just the gestation and the producing of, of eating and digesting and shitting and like everything that a person needs, breathing, to live life. Work is more of the creation of artifacts or products. And then action is political action. It's the ability for people to gather together and decide things for themselves. And so the more I play video games, the more I can see that so many developers focus on that left tier, the labor. Sometimes there is work, Super Mario Maker, you can produce levels, you can produce work. And so there is a sort of creative experience within the framework of the Mario platforming system, 2-dimensional. And then there's action, which very few games really mention. And so I reference Valheim because there are world modifiers that they came out with where you can decide with your group what to do to create the experience that you would like to see. And the way that I was able to do that and then to create a server felt very empowering to me. Not a lot of gamers have that opportunity to dictate for themselves what kind of experience they and their friends would like to have that is fully separate from somebody else. So I am very curious to see what the split is going to be in Light No Fire. I suspect it'll be, once again, labor and work, where a lot of people find No Man's Sky to be so grindy because they're just trying to progress through these systems without really being fully aware of what those systems enable for the player. They're just sort of systems that enable you to have better versions of equipment and things like that. So I think with action, the question is going to be how much can people gather? How much can people side with NPCs? What conflicts will arise between players, and what tools does the game offer to ameliorate that? I don't know. I doubt any of these things will happen, basically. So, we're in the 2020s, and Light No Fire is clearly basing a lot of its technology on No Man's Sky. And so No Man's Sky was really innovative in its time. But I think where Hello Games had the opportunity to be innovative once again, I'm not seeing it as much as I so obviously did when I saw No Man's Sky for the first time. I'm worried about the NPCs turning everything into a tourist vacation where they're just going to be everywhere and everything's going to feel like a backyard and nothing is going to feel like a totally alien wilderness. Because in order for that to happen, you need to not see people for a long time. I was under the impression that there weren't going to be NPCs in this game at all, and that we would be effectively the NPCs on the Earth, totally unexplored, right? And when we saw players, that would be quite shocking, and we would want to converse with them to share our knowledge, and we would want to create these buildings and these places for ourselves. I do understand that video game developers want to create a world that feels alive, and so simply finding ancient ruins is not enough for a lot of people. I think a lot of people really do like NPCs, and they do like entering cities or spaces. So I think I'm in the minority when it comes to that sort of thing. The question is that are they going to offer both? Because in No Man's Sky, they really don't offer an even balance for both. It's very heavy on these alien races are everywhere and they're shitting in your backyard. And so I hope that that's not the case here. I hope that there is a balance between huge empty expanses and NPCs. I think we're coming to the end, because the rest of this is just sort of the final, I don't know, stinger for some hidden aspect of the world. Okay, I've talked a lot, and hopefully you found this enjoyable. If not, I'm kind of just saying a lot of this stuff for myself. So it's okay if you don't want to watch this whole thing. It was really great for me to get a lot of my thoughts out on this. I say a lot of these things, and I say that I'm nervous about so many of these things, but truth be told, I am very excited, and I got this wave of optimism when I saw this trailer, just because I think I'm ready for another Hello Games title. I'm ready to be placed into a space that is unknown to a lot of people, and the question is going to be, does it earn the right to be explored? I think a lot of No Man's Sky players recognized fairly quickly the repetition of its biomes, its planets, and that the slight variations between those things were not enough to engender a sense of novelty in their exploration. And I think that that is going to be the determining factor for this one. I think when a lot of people say that they love No Man's Sky now, that is one of the things that they lament right off the bat. They say, hey, listen, exploration isn't going to do much for you. And Hello Games has leaned into that because they created this base building mechanic because they realized that not a lot of players move around as much as they thought. There's quite a lot more people who want to domesticate. And to me, the question is going to be, what is the ratio of explorers to domesticators in Light No Fire? I, for one, have this, for some reason, unshakable desire to circumnavigate this earth, to walk seamlessly from one place to, or from one around, possibly the equator. I'm going to assume that the equator would be the ideal way to do it, and to go west or east, and to not use portals, and to not use mounts, and to use ships or swim, I guess, whenever that is necessary. And that sounds like a lot of fun to me on paper. I don't know what challenges I would face. I don't know what tedium I would have to face. I imagine that every so often I would create a small base camp where I would just put signage that says I was here on this date, and I continued west. And I don't know if I could build a road. Are people going to be able to build roads? Are there ways for them to demarcate what is explored space versus not explored space? We'll have to see. But all of these questions, I think, are really fascinating to talk about with video games, just because all of these ideas seem rather new. Oftentimes, space has been created to present you with the developer's experience in mind. And there is some of that here with Light No Fire, just because the art assets, the aesthetic, the classic fantasy leanings, they do want you to have an experience within the framework. But on the other hand, they are quite liberal, quite freeing in giving you a set of tools that you can go out and you can have this kind of experience if you so wish. If you want to explore just one continent, if you want to circumnavigate, if you want to domesticate, all of these options are in there. And the story of the game is in you uncovering that for yourself and the problem-solving challenge of, okay, how do I do this? And that's cool. Like, we don't really have, as far as my history of gaming is concerned, that hasn't happened all too often. Now, it has happened with Valheim, and that'll be the big question for me is this the next survival title that I play? I'm hoping that it will, but then again, Valheim is still releasing the Ashlands update and still needs to do its Deep North update, so it's not quite reached 1.0, but we'll have to see. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I think I'm going to sign off, and I hope you're excited too. I hope you are as excited as I am. A lot of questions that have to be answered, and I hope this comes out in 2024. Uh, I think the gap between No Man's Sky's announcement and release date was 2.5 years because it was announced in 2013 at the end of 2013, and then it came out in 2016. Um, there were a lot of things that happened back then that, their space was flooded, and then they were creating this very new technology. Whereas I feel like now there's less innovation on that technology. I'm such an armchair critic. In all likelihood, I'm sure there's a lot of technical work that went into this. Um, but I really hope that we can see a release date in 2024. It would really kill me if it was 2025 or 2026. I think that would be, oh God, that would be sad. Very sad. Anyway, so I'm crossing my fingers for a 2024 August release date. And if not, plenty of other games to play, plenty of books to read. So I'll be fine. But anyway, have a good rest of your day. And I'll see you in the unexplored Earth someday, perhaps. Goodbye.